everyone, Jill here and welcome back to Whispering Willow Farm. I am starting a fun series on sourdough and we are going to be diving into all things sourdough. But before we can dive into creating a sourdough starter, troubleshooting your starter, making loaves, I thought we really needed to go back to the basics and address what is sourdough. If you have been following my channel, you know we do a lot of sourdough. I do a lot of cooking recipes specifically with sourdough, but I have never really address this, really important thing, and that is breaking down what sourdough is. I want you guys to have a really clear understanding of what sourdough is before you start jumping into your baking journey, because it's important to know the fundamentals and where it started from. So let's dive in and talk about what is sourdough. All right, so first up, breads can be categorized by either a leavened bread or an unleavened bread, okay? And so the leavened breads are doughs that rise during that bread making process. This is where sourdough would fall into that category, right? And this is caused by the gases that are released in as the grains in the dough begin to ferment, it releases this gas, okay? But then unleavened breads are things like a flatbread or a tortilla, right? Things that don't require that rise process. Like if you're baking with a sourdough discard and you're just wanting that sourdough flavor, but you don't, I have several recipes where we're not letting it, ferment for a long period of time and rise. We're just getting that tangy sourdough flavor. Those are things that would be an unleavened bread. So sourdough is one of those things that is considered a leavened bread, but instead of using a baker's yeast, which is what you would find if you go to buy, a loaf of bread from the grocery store, it is created by a baker's yeast. So instead of using a baker's yeast, sourdough rises by wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria. And so instead of using that packaged commercial yeast, you are combining literally flour and water, and you are creating this bacteria that is going to further your fermentation process down the road. So you'll often hear things like sourdough starter. You cannot make sourdough bread without your sourdough starter. And what that is it's a mix of that wild yeast, that lactic acid bacteria, and you've got flour and water, and then you put all this together, and between the breakdown of the flour reacting with the water, that's how you're creating those wild yeast and that good bacteria. And then this is called your sourdough starter, and you will need to have your starter before you can make any sourdough bread. So we have a sourdough starter that we sell. If you would like to go ahead and purchase one, the link is down below, but I am going to do a second edition to this, and I'm actually going to teach you guys how to make your own sourdough starter, because it really is just flour and water. Now you do need to know the fundamentals of sourdough, right? You need to understand how it works. You need to know the process. That way you can troubleshoot effectively and just start your baking sourdough journey having the most success that you can. So what happens is during your bread making process, that starter starts to ferment the sugars in the dough, all right? And this is helping your bread rise, first of all, but it's also enabling that very distinct sourdough flavor. Some people call it tangy, some people call it sour. If you've ever bought sourdough from the store though, and it's like really just kind of really pungent, there is a very, very high possibility that they have added flavors to that to create that sour, taste. And it's actually, if you buy sourdough from the store, you really want to read your ingredients, because most of the time it's not as healthy and it's not a true sourdough, which is a really big reason why I encourage you guys to make your own sourdough, buy it from an artisan, maybe buy it from a farmer's market, because more than likely it is that true sourdough without any added flavors, and therefore it's going to have the most health benefits and be the easiest for you to digest versus a store-bought sourdough. That yeast that's naturally found in your sourdough bread is thought to increase your bread's nutrient content, and then also make it easier for your body to digest it versus using commercial baker's yeast, which is why a lot of people switch to sourdough bread, because it does have that long fermentation process. It makes it easier for your body to break it down and actually absorb it and digest it. All right, so starting out, it's super important just to remember that your store-bought bread is going to be leavened with a commercial baker's yeast, whereas your sourdough bread is going to be leavened by wild yeast and that lactic bacillus bacteria, which is actually a lot better for you. We just talked about it's easier for your body to digest it and consume it, and all that good stuff. And so that's just kind of one thing to know. You can make bread using yeast, but essentially what the sourdough is you're creating your own starter with that flour and water mixture, and then it's creating all of those wild yeast and those good bacteria. And then that's what you're using to then add to you know, your flour, your salt, any other ingredients that you want to put into your dough, and you're building out your dough, and then it's got this long fermentation process that's taking place, which is causing your bread to actually rise instead of that instant baker's yeast. So trust me, I get it. I just threw a lot of words at you guys, a lot of things you might be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm still confused, I don't understand. I want to break down sourdough to make it easy for you to understand, and I genuinely believe you cannot dive into your sourdough journey and bake bread unless you know the fundamentals of how it works. This is very important. You don't have to have this deep, you know, knowledge of it, but you do need to have an overview that, you know, instead of using a commercial yeast to make regular bread, you're going to have a sourdough starter that you either have to buy or create to make your sourdough bread. It's not a quick process. It's a long fermenting process. However, there still are those things that you can make using your sourdough discard that add flavor but don't actually rise. They don't, you know, make your bread rise. It's your flatbread, some discard recipes, things of that nature. But overall, sourdough is simple, right? There are some fancy and technical words which we're gonna go and deep dive into vocabulary in a later video, just telling you guys what these words means that you might, you know, autolize. That might be a word that you hear when you're reading a sourdough recipe, or maybe you're, you know, talking to another sourdough baker. We're gonna break down these things and simplify it, but knowing how sourdough works is one of just the first steps, and it's knowing that it's a leavened bread. It's knowing that sourdough comes from those wild yeast and that lactic acid bacteria. Once you kind of have that understanding, then there's a lot of wiggle room, right? You can understand, well, what if my starter didn't rise? What if my bread didn't rise? Well, when you know the fundamentals, you can go back through and start troubleshooting these things. So I hope that this video was just kind of a quick rundown of what sourdough is. It gives you a better understanding of what it is so that you can feel equipped and prepared and ready to start making sourdough bread. Tune back in next week as I walk through making a sourdough starter from scratch. I'm going to teach you guys everything I know about it. That way, if you want to start making bread, you can start taking steps towards that today. But thank you all for hanging out with me. I'll talk to you soon.